Donald Trump, hands off Venezuela. De inmediati.
Well, a passionate President Maduro there warning Donald Trump to back off. But of course, Trump's not listening and continues to interfere in Venezuela's politics. A week ago, he and many other Western leaders backed this man, Maduro's rival, who declared himself president. But Maduro refused to step down, and backed by Russia and Turkey, he holds on to power. Why is everyone getting involved? Could it have something to do with Venezuela having the biggest known oil reserves on the planet? Of course it can, but there's also a principle at stake here: democracy. And whose country is it anyway?
Tens of thousands of Venezuelans have taken the streets of the capital, Caracas, in an attempt to topple President Maduro from power.
These people have had enough. I think it was inevitable that this would happen, but this is going to get violent where it already is.
They'll continue protesting until the Venezuelan leader gives up his hold on power.
Guaido is the man that challenges his legitimacy.
Juro asumir formalmente las competencias del Ejecutivo Nacional como el presidente encargado de Venezuela.
He gave himself the oath of office, so you have two men calling themselves the President of Venezuela.
Colombia and Brazil have already recognized the MP as president instead of Mr. Maduro, as have other South American governments.
President Trump is taking sides in the political crisis brewing in Venezuela. He's announced his support for opposition leader Juan Guaido.
Now it's time for every other nation to pick a side. No more delays, no more games.
Sayın Trump'ın bu tür bir açıklaması beni de şok etmiştir.
Вашингтоном осуществляется попытка совершения государственного переворота в этой стране.
Israel joins the United States, Canada, most of the countries of Latin America, and countries in Europe in recognizing the new leadership in Venezuela.
Battled President Nicolas Maduro, accusing the U.S. of leading a coup to force him from power.
Y la sangre que pueda correr en Venezuela será sangre que estará en sus manos, Presidente Donald Trump.
The president has made it very clear on this matter that all options are on the table.
Guaido is investing in the people, and he wants them to come out onto the streets once again this week, whereas Nicolas Maduro is investing in the army. He knows that's where his power lies.
Traidores nunca, leales siempre. Así debe ser.
Compañero, el juego cambió. El pueblo está en la calle. El pueblo va a seguir en la calle.
Well, let's bring in our panel now. We're joined by the journalist and political commentator, Javier Farje. We also have the Latin America expert, Vanessa Neumann. She's actually born in Venezuela and now lives in New York. And we also have Diego Moiro Campos. So he's joining us from London. He's also Venezuelan, and he's the Latin America risk analyst with IHS Markit. Now, Diego, day to day, you have your sources in Venezuela. You're very up to date and informed. Who's in charge of Venezuela right now?
At the moment, Maduro continues being in charge of government functions, and so far, he continues having military support. Nevertheless, his administration is not being recognized internationally, and Juan Guaido, the head of the National Assembly, who has assumed the presidency according to the Constitution, is the one who's being recognized by the US, by Canada, and many EU countries.
Now, the whole challenge against Maduro is that his 2018 election was invalid. It wasn't free and fair. And 14 Latin American countries, the United States and so on, agree with that. But the election observers, they're not particularly coming out in that opinion.
Well, the thing with the 20 May presidential election is that the government did not allow for international observers on the ground. There was an opposition candidate, Henry Falcon.
Wasn't it the case that Venezuela actually asked for the UN to monitor the election, and that the opposition said, don't, it will just give it legitimacy?
The problem with the government is that what the Maduro's administration understands as international observers is not what the rest of the world understands as international observers. They call them international companions, which basically is some international guests they bring into the country, but they do not have real access, power to make their in-depth assessments over what's going on in the different polling stations. So as such, from an international standard point of view, from an electoral point of view, that election did not have international observers. And those who had some access to the coverage confirmed that it was a massive electoral fraud.
I want to add one more thing to what Diego said, that actually the guy who ran this the voting machine, Smartmatic, the CEO, came out and said that the machines were rigged. And then he fled the country. So they actually announced that the vote was rigged. And that was a huge press conference, and they fled after that. And held, so we know that that's the case. If the vote is not deemed legitimate and is not recognized, which was not recognized at the time by more than 50 countries and the National Assembly within Venezuela, then the presidency is deemed vacant on the day that his presidency ran out. So he was supposed to be sworn in on January 10th. Since there was no election, then the presidency would be fruit from a poison tree, so to speak, or non-existent tree. And according to the constitution that rules the country, which is the one that Hugo Chavez drafted in 1999, that's the one in force, it automatically falls to the president of the National Assembly, which is Juan Guaido.
Well, let's get a different view now. We go to Javier Farje. Javier, it seems that the election was not fair and not free, and that Juan Guaido does have a legal basis to push Maduro out of power, assume the presidency, and call for new elections. Would you agree?
No, it depends who you talk to. Claudio Fermin, who was a spokesperson, the campaign chief of Henry Falcón, the unofficial presidential candidate of the opposition, said very clearly that he did not believe that there was fraud. He had observers in polling stations, and according to Mr. Fermin, who was supposed to be vice president, if Mr. Falcón had won, he said that we have to be very clear, we have to put our feet on the ground, there was no fraud, quote unquote. Also, Mr. Francisco Rodriguez, the economic advisor of Mr. Henry Falcón, said that he did not believe there was fraud. I was an observer for the regional elections in 2017, and I was given access, full access to the polling stations and the machinery used for that. So it depends who you talk to. Obviously, the opposition, which did not, the official opposition did not take part in the election, they claimed that there was fraud.
What about, okay.
However, you're absolutely right. There were no observers, international observers. A joint delegation of Mr. Falcón and the ruling party went to the UN asking for observers, and that offer was declined. So they were not really actually independent observers, but some observers from different organizations in Latin America.
Okay, well, that's a technical aspect of it, Javier. But what about the atmosphere? Let me quote from the UN High Commission for Human Rights here. He says, the context for the presidential poll does not in any way fulfill the minimal conditions for free and credible elections. And he may be referring to the numerous political prisoners and people who are in exile or have been prevented from running in the election. You don't agree with that?
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I'm not saying that I disagree with that. I'm just trying to use the fact that we have available at the moment. There are many people within Venezuela who believe that they had the chance to vote, that there was free and fair elections. And of course, the UN's report has to be taken seriously into account, and the UN will have to provide enough evidence to disqualify the polls as legitimate or not. I'm not saying there was no fraud. I'm saying that based on the information received by people from the opposition who were present in the polling stations, the vote was fair in Venezuela.
Just from a common sense point of view, who in their right mind would re-elect a president who has presided over a country where the inflation is the highest in the world, the economy is shrinking at the greatest rate in the world, and the murder rate is almost second to none?
When I talk to Venezuelans, when I've been to Venezuela, this is the perception I have about the people who vote for Maduro. First of all, the Chavistas have a constituency that has been widely ignored by the international media and all that. They have a constituency that still vote loyally for Maduro. What is the fear that many people have to vote, why they vote for Maduro and they wouldn't vote for the opposition. Because many people fear in Venezuela that some of the social projects that Chavez implemented in Venezuela will be wiped out by the opposition if they take over control of the government. Therefore, they rather go for the lesser evil rather than the best choice.
Thank you, Javier. Now, let's take a look at who is backing who in this. The countries highlighted in blue on this map are backing Juan Guaido, and the ones highlighted in red are supporting Maduro. The ones in yellow are calling for new elections, that's including the European Union, or they threaten to recognise Juan Guaido. Now, why have they divided up as they have? Let's start with the Americans. Here's the Vice President, Mike Pence.
Hola, I'm Mike Pence. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power. He's never won the presidency in a free and fair election, and he's maintained his grip of power by imprisoning anyone who dares to oppose him. The United States joins with all freedom-loving nations in recognizing the National Assembly as the last vestige of democracy in your country, for it's the only body elected by you, the people.
Well, let's go to the United States then, Vanessa Neumann. Vanessa, when you saw the Trump administration moving decisively like this, did it gladden your heart or did it make you incredibly worried about a big intervention?
No, it gladdened my heart, actually, because what has happened is that Venezuelans have not been able to fend for themselves. There was nothing to be done within the country. The institutions were corrupted. The abuse, the human rights abuses, torture. You had a National Assembly. He just established another one. So for a long time, they haven't been able to find their way out. And finally, Venezuelans realized that with this enormous diaspora, what we needed to do was to activate the diaspora, the Venezuelans overseas, to plead with the international community to please find a way to help us diplomatically, the way they've been doing, with recognition, with protections, and or sanctions. And the constitutional moment was perfect.
Okay, Diego, I want to come to you for a moment. When the United States says it's intervening in order to restore Venezuelan democracy, most people just need to take a look at the most important priority, which is America first. And that should tell you where America's interest lies. Would you say that?
No, that's definitely not the case for Venezuela. What the U.S. is doing at the moment is going in line what the rest of the region is demanding for Venezuela's democratic, to pave the way for a democratic transition, for constitutional democratic order to be restored. And in the same position that countries like, for example, Brazil, which traditionally has served as a counterbalance to the U.S. in the region, is demanding, countries like Colombia, countries like Peru, countries like Argentina. So there's a general consensus around Latin America that what started as a political, economic, and social crisis has become a full-blown migration and humanitarian crisis that needs a regional solution. So what the U.S. is basically doing is just simply aligning with what the rest of Latin America and indeed the EU and democratic countries of the world like Australia, New Zealand are demanding.
Okay, so far the United States has intervened politically and via sanctions, but could a military intervention be possible? We did see on John Bolton's notepad that he'd scribbled 5,000 troops to Colombia. Is that a bluff or is he serious? Here's the view of one military analyst.
When we did a regime change in Panama in 1989, that was 28,000 troops in a night raid, essentially, that lasted a couple of days. And in Haiti in 1994, that was another close to 28,000, and the U.S. led the coalition to do that. So obviously 5,000 does not get you a regime change.
Back to Vanessa Neumann, who is in New York. Vanessa, for a living, you look at the risk of certain situations developing in these countries. Do you see a risk of a U.S. military invasion?
I have actually written the manual or approved the manual on counterinsurgency in Colombia for the U.S. Special Forces. So I know a little bit about the subject. 5,000 troops would actually help with some border security and counterinsurgency operations if the ELN, which is housed in Venezuela and taken over 60% of the territory, flows across to Colombia to make that a staging ground for a counter regime change terrorist operation. That would be the best you could hope for from John Bolton's notebook.
Well, maybe a little insight there clear up that slightly cryptic remark on his notepad. Now, over in the other corner, there is Maduro's biggest backer, Russia. Here's their position.
По сути, у нас на глазах бесцеремонно, с нарушениями всех норм международного права, Вашингтоном осуществляется попытка совершения государственного переворота в этой стране.
Interesting. Let's go back to Vanessa for a moment. Vanessa, we hear the Russians there talking about violating international norms. You do research that is used by the United Nations. Just tell me, what is the international law perspective on this, and what can the UN do about it, if anything?
Well, the UN will always be rather, shall we say, recalcitrant or obstreperous, to use sort of slightly elegant words, in recognizing the Guaido regime, because they specialize in recognizing states and not governments. What seems to have happened is in the early 1990s, when I first started working with the UN, you had the responsibility to protect really prevailed, which made situations like intervening to defend the human rights of the Venezuelan people and the legitimacy of its government was very much in vogue. That seems to have happened. That seems to have gone out the window. What happens with the international support is you need to follow the constitutional thread. And in Venezuela, the constitutional thread of legality falls on Juan Guaido. So the Russians are wrong here.
Thank you, Vanessa. Well, it's not just Russia. Maduro also has a very strong and vocal friend in Turkey. You may recall late last year he visited Istanbul en route back from China and carved out a little time to eat at the famous Nusret or Salt Bay restaurant. Well, President Erdogan has shown he is a steadfast ally, and this is what he's had to say on the current situation.
Demokrasinin mücadelesini verenler, dünyada demokrasi mücadelesi verenlerin ve sandıkta çıkanların yanında yer alması gerekir diye düşünüyorum. Ve bu konuda milli iradeye aykırı yollarla bazı yöntemlerin denenmesini doğru bulmuyorum.
Well, it's quite extraordinary how this issue has really divided world powers. But why does everyone care about this reasonably small country? I mean, it has a slightly smaller population than Peru, and when did that last make the headlines? Could it be all that oil, perhaps? Venezuela has the highest known oil reserves in the world, and its economy is basically built on it. In fact, 95% of all exports are oil-related, and that's risky. OK, if the oil price is going up, as it was for much of Hugo Chavez's presidency, but when the price starts to fall, the weaknesses of such an oil-reliant economy are soon exposed. And guess who has a controlling hand over the oil industry? Yeah, it's the military, which is standing by Maduro for now. And they're the real kingmakers in Venezuela. 500,000 strong, an annual budget of $5 billion. The Venezuelan military is the muscle behind Maduro. They hold key positions in government and business, which in Venezuela basically means one thing: oil. With oil accounting for around 90% of the country's export earnings, it is the heart of what's left of the economy. And the military is all over it. This is Major General Manuel Guaido. He is the head of the state oil company PDVSA, which controls something like half of all the oil production in the country. Controlling PDVSA, the military's had it good for a long time, but the game's up. The Trump administration's targeted the company with massive sanctions.
Today's measure totals $7 billion in assets blocked today, plus over $11 billion in lost export proceeds over the next year.
But oil is not the only game in town. The military also controls the import and distribution of food. Venezuela imports most of its food, but with the local currency practically worthless, the shelves are bare. Maduro's answer to the crisis was to put the defense minister, Vladimir Lopez, in charge of everything from butter to rice. But the military is reportedly making huge profits. How? Well, the top brass has reportedly been getting the food at the official exchange rate and then selling it at the black market rate, making millions of dollars in profit. The military's involvement in the Venezuelan economy doesn't stop there. They also control a TV station, an auto manufacturer, a bank, and a mine. Hand in hand then, the government and military control a great deal of the commerce in Venezuela, shielding them from the privations many ordinary Venezuelans have had to endure. A hard fact to swallow. Let's go to Javier Farje for a moment. Javier, so far, the Venezuelan military has shown itself to be loyal to President Maduro. Why is that, do you think?
I visited a barracks in 2017 when I was an observer for the regional elections in Lara State, west of Caracas. And I met the generals who were in charge of the protection of the voters for that election. And I noticed two things when my visit to those barracks. One, that they are heavily politicized. Apart from the elements that you have mentioned in the video, which I'm not disputing, there's an element of politicization of the Venezuelan army by Chavez. Chavez learned that lesson after the failed coup of 2002, when he was almost deposed for 48 hours, and he realized that unless he had the army part of his political project, they could turn their back on him. But at the same time, the threat of a possible invasion. There were graphics in that barracks which showed how they were going to repel a possible invasion by the Americans, have galvanized the army and made it possible for many people to say, look, we might disagree with some of the things that Mr. Maduro does, but as army people, we have to protect the territory. So added to what you put in your video and the elements I'm giving you, that guarantees for the time being anyway, support by the military to President Maduro.
Now, the Venezuelan military envoy to Washington was the first to crack. I don't know if that's going to be typical, but let's just listen to him defecting to Juan Guaido.
El día de hoy me dirijo al pueblo de Venezuela y en especial a mis hermanos de la Fuerza Armada Nacional con la finalidad de reconocer como único presidente legítimo al presidente Juan Guaidó.
Back to Javier for a bit of analysis on that one. Javier, is this the beginning of the end, or is this an anomaly in the armed forces?
That colonel, who actually rightly so has defected, is a minor element of the army. He's been there for many years. One solo makes no summer, as the saying says. But at the same time, we mustn't forget that it is not the first time that some army people have turned their back on the government. It's happened before a few times, but it doesn't really mean that institutionally the army is on the side of Mr. Guaido. And that is the big problem that Mr. Guaido has. He doesn't control the army. For as long as that doesn't happen, he won't be able to control anything in Venezuela. Furthermore, during the weekend, there was a campaign of delivering papers of amnesty to barracks and police stations by members of the opposition that backfired because they were rejected by the people who received this amnesty, because they would be assuming that if you are given an amnesty, that means that the people have done something wrong and they haven't. So no, this guy doesn't make a big difference in terms of the institutional support that Maduro still has from the armed forces.
Vanessa, we know and have had reports of Juan Guaido talking to the military, secret talks behind closed doors. Can you confirm or deny those reports?
Yes, I mean that's absolutely true. It is not a secret within the Venezuelan opposition, with whom I am in daily contact, that they are trying to get the military to come on side of the Constitution. The message is, join the people of Venezuela, follow the Constitution, pledge your allegiance to Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader, and please come all together. Nobody wants the military to fracture. Nobody wants one military brother against another to kill each other. Nobody wants civil war.
But what would it take
so the message...
Vanessa, if you look at it this way, they have a lot at stake here, the military, because they're so involved in the government itself. So what would it take to entice them to defect to Juan Guaido?
Well, amnesty, and of course the other thing that happened yesterday is also the sanctions against PDVSA. The problem is that they are very deeply embedded with any manner of criminal activity, drug trafficking. The food supply system is a tremendous form of corruption that keeps them in line, kleptocracy, money laundering. So they're afraid that if they leave, that'll stop. Now, with the oil going away, because of the sanctions, the money from the oil and the bank accounts being handed to Guaido, you're going to see increasing unrest, because they say we're up to our necks in all of this, potential criminal charges, and there'll be no payment. And the only way we can do this is to shift our allegiance. So that is designed to fracture them from within and put additional pressure for them to switch allegiance.
Diego, let me pick up on that, actually. Vanessa mentioned it, the massive sanctions by the United States, the new sanctions on PDVSA, which is the state-owned, state-run oil company. What effect will that have on the country?
It's a game changer. It will affect their capacity to pay public administration, public spending, and more importantly, as Vanessa said, it will affect the loyalty that the security apparatus, the military and the police have towards Maduro.
Diego, thank you for that. Well, it's amazing to think back in the 1970s, Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America, and Caracas was a very fashionable place to be.
Caracas, the swinging city of Venezuela. Good climate, fine buildings, wide highways with plenty on them. All in all, a pretty nice place to be for many reasons. Caracas is a good place in which to be young. The Centro Comercial Chacatio building is the place for mod gear. Boutiques abound, crammed with pace-setting clobber, hot from the fashion centre in London W1.
Thank you to you and all our guests, and thank you for watching. If you've missed any of our episodes or want to see them again, they're on our YouTube channel. But till next week, goodbye and thank you for watching.